Jax Weston had faced some rough landings in his time, but none quite like this. His shuttle barely made it through Andromeda Research Base's docking bay, its thrusters sputtering as he coasted to a rough stop. The Zorathian Empire's research station was renowned for its advanced technology, its sterile beauty, and its intense secrecy. Only a handful of humans had been granted entry, and Jax was about to join their ranks. But the rumors he'd heard, they didn't even begin to do it justice. As he disembarked, he found himself staring up at towering silver walls and seamless panels of radiant blue light, each corridor lined with unfamiliar tech that pulsed like something alive. The place felt less like a research facility and more like a fortress, a high-tech vault of secrets where humans were viewed as fascinating curiosities to be studied. And, in this case, tested. He glanced down at the message he'd received en route. Assigned to Dr. Ilara of Zorathian Institute for Behavioral and Cultural Compatibility Assessment. Prepare for examination. Behavioral assessment? Compatibility? He had no idea what that meant, but he had the sinking feeling he was about to find out. As Jax tried to blend in, a tall figure appeared at the far end of the corridor. She was unmistakable, Dr. Ilara, his assigned examiner. Her skin shimmered in the facility's cool light, a soft shade of blue that seemed to mirror the star-strewn void beyond the station's walls. Her features were sharp, her gaze intense, and her eyes, a startling silver, locked onto his with an intensity that made him catch his breath. Jax Weston, she said, her voice cool and steady as she approached him. You arrived precisely on schedule. He nodded, trying to look composed. That's me.
Happy to be here.
Doc. He held out his hand for a shake, but she simply stared at it, her head tilting slightly, as though she was examining a foreign artifact. After a moment's pause, she extended her own hand, touching his lightly. Her fingers were cool, almost metallic, but her expression remained impassive, her gaze unblinking. A human greeting ritual, she observed, noting every detail with clinical precision. Fascinating. You use this contact to initiate trust. Yes? Jax chuckled, pulling back his hand. Well, that's one way to put it. She nodded thoughtfully, glancing at the digital pad in her hand. Welcome to the Andromeda Research Base. I am Dr. Ilara. Your arrival here is part of an experimental study into human bonding practices, behavioral tendencies, and unusual customs. She raised an eyebrow, almost questioning his sanity for having agreed to this. You are aware of the nature of the study? Yes, behavioral assessment. Right, Jax replied, a little uncertainly. I'm here to give you some human insights. Precisely, she said, gesturing for him to follow. Her tone was formal, her stride brisk, as though this were just another day at the office and he was another test subject. Our objective is to understand how humans form connections, develop alliances, and respond to various stimuli. Jax tried to hide a grin. Stimuli? Huh? Sounds intense. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. Our simulations are not lighthearted, but I was assured you are equipped for this assignment. She paused, then added, Your reputation precedes you. He felt a flicker of pride but kept his tone casual. They did send you the best. They entered a large chamber filled with screens and strange equipment he'd never seen. Holograms hovered above sleek tables, and strange metal devices hummed softly along the walls. This wasn't your average lab. In the center was a circular platform, clearly designed for observation, surrounded by floating displays showing his biodata, heart rate, and various readings he didn't understand. Please step onto the observation platform, Ilara instructed, her eyes narrowing in curiosity. Our first exercise will test proximity responses, trust dynamics, and physical coordination under duress. Jax's brow furrowed. Wait, under duress? No one mentioned that. Ilara tapped her tablet, glancing at him with a faint glint of amusement in her otherwise controlled expression. Humans rely on their physical proximity to others in high-stress situations. We will observe this. With a shrug, Jax stepped onto the platform, and immediately a transparent barrier rose around him. The hum of the chamber grew louder, and a holographic environment materialized, transforming the room into what looked like a dense, alien jungle. Trees towered above him, their leaves glowing in faint shades of blue and green, casting an otherworldly light across the simulated terrain. "Observe the simulation," Ilara's voice echoed from somewhere beyond the trees. "This environment is designed to resemble Harlech's Prime, a notoriously dangerous jungle planet in the Zorathian system." Jax took a deep breath, feeling the hum of the holographic generators beneath his feet. "Nice touch," he called out, scanning the trees as a soft, eerie growl rumbled in the distance. "What's next?" "Your mission is simple," Ilara replied. "Navigate to the end of the jungle without disruptions." He didn't like the sound of that. "And if there are disruptions, survive them," she said simply, her tone still maddeningly calm. Jax rolled his eyes and took a step forward, cautiously scanning the jungle. He barely made it 3 steps before a holographic creature, a snarling beast with gleaming eyes and rows of razor-sharp teeth, emerged from the shadows, lunging toward him. Instinct kicked in, and he sidestepped the creature, grabbing a nearby branch and holding it out like a spear. The creature hesitated, growling as it circled him. His pulse quickened, but he held his ground, waiting for the next move. This wasn't real, he reminded himself, but it was realistic enough to make his palms sweat. "Interesting," Ilara's voice commented over the speakers. "Your heart rate has increased by 24%, yet you appear composed. Is this due to training, or is it instinctual?" "A bit of both," he replied, sidestepping again as the beast lunged. "Helps to keep a cool head when things get intense." "Fascinating," she murmured, sounding as though she was taking notes. "Continue." As he advanced through the jungle, more creatures appeared, each one faster and more unpredictable than the last. He dodged, ducked, and used whatever he could to evade them, his adrenaline spiking with every close call. But through it all, he could feel Ilara watching, her voice occasionally breaking the silence to ask questions about his thought process, his reactions, and his instincts. Finally, he reached the end of the jungle, emerging onto a cliff overlooking a holographic ocean that stretched into the distance. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he glanced back at the simulation. Despite the intensity, he couldn't help but feel a sense of exhilaration. The simulation faded, and the transparent barrier lowered, bringing him back to the sleek, metallic lab. Ilara approached him, her expression a mix of curiosity and something he couldn't quite place. "You displayed impressive composure," she observed, studying him closely. "Most of my subjects are less prepared." He shrugged, trying to downplay it. "Guess you picked the right human." She raised an eyebrow, her gaze intense. "Perhaps. We will conduct further sessions to test more aspects of human behavior." He grinned, intrigued by the challenge in her tone. "Bring it on." "Duh, I can handle whatever you've got." A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips, a rare, almost imperceptible sign of amusement. "We shall see." Jax Weston. As she turned to lead him out of the lab, Jax couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. He'd signed up for an adventure, and it seemed Dr. Ilara and her simulations were about to give him exactly that. The next morning, Jax arrived in the lab expecting another round of holographic monsters, or maybe some alien landscape simulation. Instead, Ilara stood waiting for him beside a sleek, silver console that pulsed with faint blue lights. Her usually impassive face was set with a focused expression, and her silver eyes had a glint of excitement that made him pause. "Good morning, Jax," she greeted him with a curt nod. "Today's assessment will be a more intense trial. Your previous results indicate a high tolerance for simulated scenarios, so I have adjusted the parameters." "Adjusted the parameters?" he repeated, trying to mask his wariness with a casual smile. "You mean you're cranking up the difficulty?" "Precisely," she replied, not a trace of humor in her voice. "This will be an endurance test, requiring both mental acuity and physical resilience. You will be completing this mission in a live-action setting." Jax raised an eyebrow. "So, no more holograms? I'm getting the real thing?" Ilara inclined her head, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "It is as close to reality as possible. Your mission will involve navigating a hazard course within our deep space training dome. The environment is designed to resemble conditions found on Valar V, a high-pressure atmosphere with gravitational fluctuations and an unpredictable climate. Jax let out a low whistle. Volar V was notorious for its hostile terrain. And what am I supposed to find out there? Ilara tapped her console, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. At the far end of the dome, you'll find an ancient data crystal, which we've placed as a decoy. Your mission is to retrieve the crystal and return without setting off any environmental alarms or, ideally, sustaining injury. And here I thought you were easing me in, he joked. She looked at him, her gaze almost playful. Aren't you the one who claimed to be the best? Jax grinned, rolling his shoulders as he prepared to dive into the unknown. Guess I did say that. With a nod, she directed him toward a door that opened into the training dome. Jax stepped inside, the steel door sliding shut behind him with a solid thud. Almost immediately, he felt the pressure in the air change, pressing down on him in a way that made each breath feel heavier. The gravity was slightly higher than Earth's, and the lighting was dim, casting strange shadows over the uneven ground that stretched before him. Mission initiated. Ilara's voice crackled over his communicator. Be mindful of the atmospheric pressure. It will fluctuate every few minutes. Your body may experience fatigue more rapidly than on Earth. Jax grunted in acknowledgement, keeping his eyes on the terrain ahead. The ground was rocky, broken by sharp ridges and patches of alien vegetation that glowed faintly underfoot. He moved cautiously, every step careful as he navigated the unfamiliar landscape. After a few minutes, the ground beneath him shook violently, nearly throwing him off balance. A wave of heat blasted up from a crevice a few feet away, and he quickly sidestepped, steadying himself as he glanced down. Beneath the cracked surface, rivers of molten lava bubbled, casting an eerie red glow across the scene. Atmospheric shift detected. Ilara's voice came over the communicator. I suggest avoiding the thermal vents. Jax rolled his eyes, muttering, Thanks for the tip, Doc. He could almost hear her amused silence in response. Pressing onward, he carefully picked his way across the rough terrain, keeping his senses sharp. The air grew thicker with each step, as though something was bearing down on him. His muscles felt heavy, his breathing labored, but he pushed on, his gaze fixed on the faint outline of a glowing object in the distance. Halfway across the dome, his communicator crackled with Ilara's voice again. Your heart rate is elevated, but you're maintaining impressive stamina, she noted, her tone both curious and clinical. It's interesting. Humans' endurance thresholds vary significantly under pressure. Glad to be your guinea pig, he panted, wiping sweat from his forehead. Maybe next time you can join me for a little first-hand research. There was a pause, and he could have sworn he heard a faint chuckle on her end. Perhaps, but Zorathians do not respond to environmental stress the same way humans do. We rely on calculated mental strategies rather than physical endurance. Maybe that's why humans like getting their hands dirty, he replied, stepping over a jagged boulder. There's nothing like going through it yourself. He was close now, just a few more yards to the crystal. But as he took another step, the ground trembled beneath him. The rocks shifted, and he stumbled forward, catching himself just in time to see a thick fog of green gas venting from a nearby fissure. The gas seeped through the air, swirling in toxic-looking plumes. Doc? He called over the communicator. What's with the green gas? Warning, Ilara replied, her tone suddenly sharper. That gas simulates Volar V's neurotoxic atmosphere. It will impair your motor functions within 60 seconds if inhaled. Jax's heart skipped a beat as he took a cautious step back. Thanks for the heads up. Any suggestions on avoiding it? There's a path to your left, she said, her voice calm and level, guiding him as though this was nothing more than a drill. If you move quickly, you should be able to avoid exposure. Jax moved without hesitation, darting left as instructed, his body protesting against the increased gravity and thickening air. His muscles burned, his lungs straining as he held his breath, fighting the urge to gulp in air. He could see the crystal now, its faint glow tantalizingly close. Finally, he reached it, grabbing the data crystal and securing it in a pouch on his belt. Just as he turned to make his way back, another tremor shook the ground. A deep rumble echoed from behind him, and he spun around to see the crevice splitting wider, molten lava seeping toward him like a slow, deadly tide. Ilara, I've got the crystal, he called, gripping the communicator. But I've got another problem here. Lava's cutting off my way back. There was a brief pause, and her voice came through, calm as ever. There is an alternate path to your right, but it will take you through an untested area of the dome. It could be unstable. Risky. Huh? He muttered, eyeing the path. Guess we'll find out. With no other choice, Jax veered to the right, maneuvering through the maze of rocks and ridges as quickly as the heavy atmosphere allowed. The ground was less stable here, shifting beneath his feet, but he pressed on, determined to complete the mission. Just as he thought he was in the clear, a jagged piece of rock crumbled under his foot, sending him stumbling forward. He caught himself, but not before the edge of his sleeve brushed against another plume of green gas. His arm tingled, a numbing sensation creeping up to his shoulder. Ilara, he grunted, pushing forward. Just a heads up, think I got a little dose of that gas. Her voice came through immediately, sharper than before. The effects should wear off within minutes if you continue moving. Avoid further exposure. Jax. Yeah, no kidding, he muttered, his voice laced with a mix of humor and tension as he pushed himself toward the exit. His arm felt sluggish, but he ignored it, focusing on the path ahead until he finally reached the end of the dome. As he stumbled out of the simulated environment, the pressure and gravity returned to normal. He took a deep breath, grateful for the sudden ease in the air. Ilara was waiting. Her usual composed expression softened just slightly, though her eyes were still sharp. Assessing. Well done, she said, her tone surprisingly warm, despite the unexpected hazards. You retrieved the crystal. Barely, he replied with a grin, holding up the data crystal. Was that supposed to be a welcome trial? She allowed herself a faint smile. Consider it an initiation. You performed admirably. Few subjects display such resilience. Jax chuckled, shaking his head. Well, Duck, I have to hand it to you. You sure know how to put a guy through his paces. She tilted her head, her gaze holding his. This is only the beginning. Jax, our studies have much more to uncover. As they exited the lab together, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that these tests were about more than just scientific curiosity. He'd come here expecting an adventure. But with each trial, Ilara seemed to be pushing boundaries he hadn't anticipated. And somehow, he couldn't wait to see what she'd throw at him next. After the intensity of his last mission, Jax thought he'd seen the worst Andromeda Base had to offer. But the following day, as he entered the lab, he noticed a different energy in the air. Ilara was at the console, her brow furrowed as she scanned a series of rapidly changing data streams. Her usual calm demeanor was disrupted, and there was a flicker of something almost like concern? Good morning, Doc. Jax greeted her, trying to lighten the mood. She looked up, her gaze sharper than usual. Jax, there's been a breach in our atmospheric integrity on the lower levels of the station. We're facing a containment failure, likely due to an unstable fusion core. If we don't secure it quickly, the entire station could be compromised. Jax raised an eyebrow, taken aback. So, this isn't one of your simulations, then? Her expression was serious. Unfortunately, no. This is a genuine emergency. I've informed the command center, but they're short on personnel, and the malfunction has disrupted several safety protocols. I require your assistance. He nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. All right, what's the plan? Ilara tapped her console, bringing up a map of the base's sublevels, where the breach had occurred. The unstable fusion core is located in Section 9B. We need to reach it, stabilize the reactor, and manually override the cooling system. I've downloaded the necessary codes and instructions, but the task will require 2 individuals. Jax smirked, feeling a familiar rush of adrenaline. Well, looks like you found the right guy for the job. Without another word, she handed him a lightweight exosuit designed for high radiation zones. He pulled it on, feeling the suit hum to life around him, its panels forming a protective shield over his torso, arms, and legs. Ilara adjusted her own suit with the same calm efficiency she approached everything, but he noticed a faint tension in her usually steady hands. Together, they left the lab and entered the narrow maintenance corridors that would lead them to Section 9B. The lights flickered as they moved deeper into the base, the temperature rising slightly with each step. A faint haze clung to the air, and the low hum of the reactor grew louder, a steady, ominous beat. This section is not typically accessible to non-Zorathian personnel, Ilara said, her voice coming through his communicator. If things become unstable, we may only have a few minutes to contain the breach before the base enters lockdown. Got it. Let's move fast. Then, Jax replied, picking up his pace. As they rounded a corner, a sudden tremor shook the hallway, sending sparks raining down from the ceiling. Ilara staggered slightly, but Jax reached out, steadying her before she could fall. Are you all right? He asked, watching her closely. She nodded, giving him a quick glance. Yes. Thank you. They continued forward, finally reaching the door to Section 9B. Ilara keyed in the access codes, and the door hissed open, releasing a wave of heat. The reactor chamber beyond was a maze of pipes, consoles, and conduits, all bathed in the pulsing red glow of the fusion core. The reactor itself was housed in a containment unit in the center, its blue energy field flickering dangerously. All right, Doc, what's the first step? Jax asked, eyeing the reactor. Over there, she said, pointing to a console across the room. We need to initiate the cooling sequence. I'll monitor the reactor's status while you handle the manual adjustments. He moved quickly, dodging exposed pipes and sparking cables as he reached the console. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the exosuit's cooling system, and he could feel the tremors growing more frequent beneath his feet. Jax entered the codes Ilara had provided, watching as the cooling system slowly activated, reducing the reactor's temperature by a fraction. But just as he thought they were making progress, a loud crack echoed through the room, and one of the reactor's stabilizer arms buckled under the pressure, releasing a burst of heat. Ilara, he shouted over the roar of the reactor. We've got a major structural failure here. Ilara glanced at the reactor, her face pale as she calculated their options. We need to reinforce the stabilizer manually. There's a control panel on the opposite side of the reactor. If you can hold it in place, I can override the failing mechanisms. Jax didn't hesitate, crossing the reactor chamber to reach the panel. The heat was almost unbearable now, even through the exosuit, and the vibrations from the unstable core made it difficult to stay steady, but he gripped the stabilizer arm, bracing himself against the force. All right, Doc, I'm in position, he called out. Do your thing. Ilara moved to the control panel beside him, her hands moving swiftly across the screen as she entered a series of complex commands. The reactor groaned, and for a moment, he thought it would give way entirely. But Ilara's calm, precise input steadied the mechanisms, reinforcing the stabilizer just enough to hold. There. The reactor should stabilize, temporarily, she said, her voice low and focused. But we only have a few minutes to reach the emergency override console and initiate a complete shutdown. Jax took a deep breath, his muscles aching from the effort. Lead the way. They moved swiftly through the chamber, reaching the emergency console just as another tremor rocked the room. Alarms blared overhead, and the lights dimmed, casting the chamber in an eerie glow. Ilara keyed in the shutdown sequence, her hands moving with impressive speed. But as she reached the final command, a flashing message appeared on the console. Manual override required. She looked at him, her expression tense. The console has locked us out. I need you to access the secondary controls on the reactor itself. Jax nodded, moving to the reactor as Ilara continued her attempts to bypass the lock. He climbed onto a narrow ledge, reaching for the secondary control panel near the reactor's energy core. The heat was overwhelming, and he could feel his suit straining under the intense temperature. All right, Doc, I'm at the panel. Just tell me what to do. Ilara's voice came through his communicator, steady and clear. You'll need to manually rotate the power regulator to the left and hold it for 10 seconds. It will release the pressure buildup long enough for me to complete the shutdown. He gritted his teeth, gripping the regulator as he began to turn it. The resistance was intense, and he could feel the vibrations shaking his entire body as he fought to hold it in place. 5 more seconds. Ilara's voice urged him, her tone tight with urgency. The seconds felt like an eternity. But finally, the reactor's hum began to die down, its energy field flickering as the pressure dissipated. Ilara entered the final command, and the reactor went dark, leaving them in silence. Jack slumped against the wall, exhaling a shaky breath. Well, that was a bit more than I signed up for. Ilara's face softened as she looked at him, her usual calm giving way to a faint smile. You performed well under pressure. I didn't expect a human to handle the reactor's instability so effectively. He smirked, trying to mask his exhaustion. Like I said, you got the best they had. They made their way out of the reactor chamber, the alarm silencing as the base's systems returned to normal. As they stepped into the cool air of the corridor, Ilara turned to face him, her gaze steady. Thank you, Jax, she said quietly, an uncharacteristic sincerity in her voice. Without your assistance, the containment breach could have had catastrophic consequences. He shrugged, giving her a crooked smile. Guess that makes us even. She nodded, her silver eyes glinting with something he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it does. I look forward to seeing how you handle our next challenge. He chuckled, feeling a surge of adrenaline at the thought. Whatever else she had in store, he was ready. After all, he'd come here for adventure, and it looked like Dr. Ilara and her high-stakes study were about to give him exactly that. After the reactor incident, Jax thought he might get a breather. But barely a day had passed when Ilara summoned him with an urgent message. Report to the command center immediately. Classified mission protocol. The words classified mission sent a jolt of excitement through Jax. He made his way to the command center, where Ilara waited, her expression serious. Unlike the other missions, there was an unspoken tension in the air, something she hadn't let him in on. Jax, she greeted him, her tone more formal than usual. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Wouldn't miss it, he replied with a grin. What's going on? She glanced around the empty command room, lowering her voice as she keyed in a sequence on the console. The base detected an unidentified signal originating from a sector beyond Andromeda Base's limits. It's coming from a section known as the Forbidden Sector. Forbidden Sector? He repeated. His curiosity piqued. Ilara nodded, her eyes fixed on the console's display. It's a restricted zone. Decades ago, Zorathian scientists conducted high-risk experiments there, work deemed too volatile and dangerous. The area was sealed off to prevent any accidental exposure. But now, a signal has been detected. We don't know what activated it or why. Let me guess. You need me to check it out? She met his gaze, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Yes, but this mission is strictly off the record. Officially, this signal doesn't exist. Command believes the risk is high, and they want us to investigate without causing panic on the base. Got it, Jax replied, his pulse quickening. Sounds like my kind of job. Ilara gave a slight nod, though he could tell by her expression that the mission made her uneasy. They prepared quickly, each suiting up with protective gear. This time, Ilara donned a sleek black exosuit with enhanced shielding, a stark contrast to her usual lab attire. Jax noticed her intense focus as she double-checked every piece of equipment, her usual composure tinged with apprehension. They navigated the winding corridors until they reached an airlock at the far end of the base. Beyond it lay the Forbidden Sector, a desolate area shrouded in mystery and long-abandoned experiments. As the airlock doors sealed behind them, a deep silence filled the corridor, broken only by the soft hum of their equipment. The Forbidden Sector stretched before them, an eerie landscape of twisted metal structures and ancient tech enshrouded in mist. The remnants of old Zorathian experiments loomed around them like the bones of giants, some rusted and others humming with faint energy. Ilara led the way, her eyes scanning the environment. The signal is coming from approximately 100 meters ahead, near an old containment chamber. Jax moved cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of a laser cutter strapped to his belt. Any idea what these experiments were about? Ilara hesitated. Officially, the records have been classified. But I've read scattered reports of Zorathian scientists testing high-energy weaponry and biotechnical research. Some biological in nature. Biological? Jax repeated, a shiver running down his spine. So, there's a chance we're walking into something alive? Possibly, she replied, her tone guarded. Zorathian command believed the sector was dormant, But this signal proves otherwise. We should proceed with caution. They continued through the misty ruins, Ilara checking her handheld scanner as they approached the containment chamber. Strange symbols were etched into the metal walls. Symbols Jax couldn't decipher, but that seemed to hold an ominous energy. "This is it," Ilara whispered, her eyes fixed on the console next to the chamber door. "The signal originates from within this structure. Looks sealed pretty tight," Jax observed, examining the reinforced door. "Any idea how to get in?" Ilara hesitated, glancing at him. "We may need to override the lock. But I must warn you, the chamber has an internal security system. It could activate if we breach it." Jax grinned, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "What's life without a little risk?" With a slight nod, Ilara activated her console, entering a sequence of codes. The chamber door shuddered, and a green light flickered above it as the lock disengaged. A faint hiss escaped as the door slid open, revealing a dark, cavernous room beyond. They stepped inside, their helmet lights cutting through the thick, stale air. The room was filled with strange machinery, large glass tanks lining the walls. Most were empty, but a few contained what looked like dark, organic matter, biological remnants that pulsed faintly with an unsettling energy. Ilara's gaze lingered on the tanks, her brow furrowing. These chambers were once used to contain experimental organisms, but these traces suggest the organisms may still be active. "Active?" Jax muttered, eyeing one of the tanks as it emitted a faint, rhythmic throb. "That doesn't sound promising." As they moved further in, Ilara's scanner beeped, displaying the signal source. In the center of the chamber stood a large control console, covered in dust and grime but still operational. She approached it cautiously, her fingers hovering over the panel. "This appears to be the origin of the signal," she murmured. "But something else is here, too, a secondary signal, faint but present." Jax peered over her shoulder, watching as she activated the console. The screen flickered to life, displaying lines of Zorathian code interspersed with strange symbols and a looping message. "Containment breach imminent. System override required." "Containment breach?" he asked, looking at her with concern. Ilara's face paled. "This message indicates that the internal security failed years ago. The organism, they've been free to adapt and evolve all this time." Before he could respond, a low growl echoed from somewhere within the chamber. Jax whipped around, his hand instinctively reaching for his laser cutter. Through the dim light, he saw shadows shifting, forms beginning to move within the darkened tanks. "Ilara," he said quietly, keeping his eyes fixed on the movement. "We might have company." Ilara nodded, her hand tightening around her own laser cutter as she took a defensive stance beside him. These organisms were originally designed to withstand extreme conditions. "We don't know what they're capable of now." The growling grew louder, and a faint hissing noise filled the room as several of the tanks cracked, their glass surfaces splintering under an unseen force. Dark shapes began to emerge, creatures with twisted limbs and luminous, unblinking eyes. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms shifting as they approached. Jax raised his weapon, adrenaline surging through him. "Any advice on handling these things?" "Keep them at a distance," Ilara replied, her voice tense. "They're sensitive to energy fields. If we disrupt their movements, we may be able to keep them back long enough to activate the containment system." Jax fired a warning shot, the laser slicing through the air and halting the nearest creature. It recoiled, its limbs twitching as it emitted a shrill hiss, but the others continued forward, their luminous eyes locked onto him and Ilara. She moved to the console, her fingers flying over the controls as she worked to reactivate the containment protocol. "Hold them off. Jax, I just need a few moments." "No problem." "Doc," he muttered, his voice tight as he fired another shot, keeping the creatures at bay. They moved like shadows, slipping through the dark and reappearing unpredictably, each one more aggressive than the last. As he fought to hold them back, Ilara continued working at the console, her brow furrowed with concentration. Finally, she slammed her hand down on the final command, and a bright light flooded the room. A containment field crackled to life around the chamber, trapping the creatures within its electric barrier. Jax stepped back, breathing hard as the creatures thrashed against the barrier, their forms flickering like ghosts. Nice work. Ilara, he said, giving her a relieved smile. Didn't think we'd get out of that one. She exhaled, her gaze lingering on the creatures. Neither did I. They exited the chamber, sealing the door behind them as they made their way back to the main sector of the base. The tension between them eased, replaced by a shared sense of triumph as they walked side by side through the empty corridors. Guess that was more than you bargained for, Jax remarked, glancing at her. Ilara's lips curved in a faint smile. Perhaps, but you performed admirably under pressure. He grinned, nudging her playfully. And you weren't too bad yourself. Doc, she looked at him, her expression softening. Thank you. Jax, you've proven to be an invaluable asset. As they reached the command center, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had shifted between them. They were no longer just scientist and subject. They were partners, bound by the thrill of the unknown and the trust they'd forged in the heat of danger. The Forbidden Sector mission had left Jax and Ilara with a newfound respect for each other, and a sense of connection that went beyond the bounds of their initial study. But before they could properly debrief, a distress signal echoed through the Andromeda base, flashing red across every console and filling the halls with a blaring alarm. What now? Jax muttered, glancing at Ilara as she checked the incoming alert. She frowned, her silver eyes scanning the command center display. It's coming from one of the base's central energy hubs. The reactor is destabilizing again, but this time it's the primary reactor. If it fails, the entire base will be destroyed. Are you serious? Jax asked, the gravity of her words settling in. Did something happen while we were in the Forbidden Sector? Ilara's jaw clenched as she typed furiously into her console. It's possible. That containment breach may have triggered a chain reaction throughout the base's older systems. There's no time to bring in reinforcements. We have to act now. Jax nodded, his adrenaline kicking in. All right. Doc, lead the way. They grabbed their emergency kits and rushed down a series of winding corridors, the red lights casting eerie shadows as they raced toward the reactor chamber. They reached the main reactor control room, a vast space filled with intricate consoles, pulsating energy conduits, and the low hum of the primary reactor core. The entire room vibrated with the force of the unstable reactor, its blue glow flickering ominously. Ilara wasted no time, immediately accessing the control panel to assess the damage. Jax watched her fingers fly over the controls, her brow furrowed with intense concentration. This is worse than I anticipated, she muttered, more to herself than to him. The reactor's cooling system has shut down, and the energy output is rising rapidly. If we don't stabilize it soon, the core will reach critical mass. Jax glanced at the reactor, which pulsed like a ticking bomb, and felt his stomach twist. So, what's the plan? Ilara's gaze was unwavering. We need to bypass the main controls and initiate a manual shutdown sequence from inside the reactor's primary conduit. It's high risk. The radiation exposure will be extreme, even with our protective gear. He nodded, his resolve firm. I'm with you, Doc. Let's get it done. They donned specialized radiation shielding and entered the inner reactor chamber, where the energy levels were almost palpable, vibrating through the floor and walls. The air was thick with heat, and the pulsing blue light of the reactor core cast an ethereal glow over everything. Ilara pointed to a narrow maintenance conduit running along the reactor's side. We need to access that conduit to reach the shutdown control. The problem is, only one of us can fit in there at a time. Jax didn't hesitate. I'll go. Just keep me connected with the control panel feed. She started to protest, but he shook his head, giving her a reassuring smile. Hey, you need to be at the controls to activate the shutdown sequence. I'll handle the hard part. After a brief hesitation, she nodded, her gaze steady. Be careful, Jax. He grinned, giving her a thumbs up before ducking into the narrow conduit. The heat was nearly unbearable as he made his way toward the manual control panel, the reactor's hum vibrating through his bones. Finally, he reached the control panel, a small console embedded within the reactor's infrastructure. He keyed into the communicator, his voice steady despite the intense conditions. All right, Doc, I'm at the panel. Tell me what I need to do. Her voice crackled over the communicator. You'll need to disable the reactor's energy regulators one by one, starting with the main cooling valve. After that, We'll have about 60 seconds to initiate the shutdown sequence, or the system will go into irreversible overload. Got it, he replied, taking a deep breath as he accessed the cooling valve. The reactor's heat intensified as he disabled the regulator, and he could feel sweat dripping down his face despite the shielding. Regulator disabled, he called out. What's next? Now for the auxiliary energy dampeners. They're located to your right. Ilara's voice was calm, but he could hear the urgency beneath her words. Once they're down, I'll activate the manual override from here. Jax located the dampeners and deactivated them one by one, the reactor's hum escalating with each disabled system. Just as he finished, the room shook violently, a tremor that sent sparks raining down from above. Ilara! What's going on? He shouted over the noise. She hesitated, her voice tense. The reactor's reaching critical mass faster than anticipated. We're running out of time. Come back now. Not until we finish this, he replied, determination in his voice. I can handle it. Just initiate the override. Jax, if you stay there, the radiation exposure could be lethal, she protested. He closed his eyes, knowing the risk but feeling a strange calm. Just trust me. Let's get this done. A brief silence followed before she spoke again, her voice steady. Understood. I'm activating the override now. You'll need to enter the final shutdown code from the panel. Jax keyed in the shutdown code as instructed, watching as the reactor's energy levels began to stabilize. The pulsing blue glow dimmed, the vibrations easing as the reactor's output decreased. He let out a breath of relief, feeling the tension in his chest finally release. It's done. Doc, he said, turning to make his way out of the conduit. We're clear. But as he began to exit, another tremor hit, knocking him off balance. He braced himself against the wall, feeling a sharp pain shoot through his arm. The tremor subsided, but he quickly realized he was wedged between two panels, his leg trapped by a fallen piece of machinery. Ilara, I'm stuck, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. Her voice came through, filled with alarm. Hold on. Jax, I'm coming in. Moments later, Ilara appeared at the entrance of the conduit, her silver eyes wide with concern as she assessed the situation. She crouched down, gripping the metal debris trapping his leg and pulling with all her strength. With a grunt, she managed to shift it just enough for him to slide free. Jax let out a relieved laugh as she helped him up. Guess I owe you one. Doc. She gave him a small smile, her eyes reflecting a mix of relief and something else he couldn't quite place. Consider us even. They exited the reactor chamber together, the base's systems returning to normal as they made their way back to the command center. The tension of the mission slowly faded, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and shared victory. As they stood in the quiet command room, Jax turned to her, his voice soft. Ilara, thanks for coming back for me. I don't think I could have done this alone. She met his gaze, her expression sincere. You have proven invaluable. Jax, I came here to study human behavior, to understand what drives you. But somewhere along the way, I realized I was no longer simply observing. I was part of it, he grinned, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the reactor's heat. Maybe that's what makes us such a good team. She tilted her head, her eyes reflecting something close to affection. Perhaps it is. They shared a quiet moment, the weight of their experiences hanging in the air. For the first time, Jax saw a side of Ilara that went beyond her scientific curiosity, a genuine, personal connection he hadn't expected. As they left the command center together, Jax felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that whatever lay ahead, they'd face it side by side. They weren't just scientist and subject anymore. They were partners, bound by trust and forged in the fires of the unknown.